The Man-Eating Leopard of Rudraprayag by Jim Corbett. Chapter 1. The Pilgrim Road. If you are a Hindu from the sun-scorched plains of India, and you desire, as all good Hindus do, to perform the pilgrimage to the age-old shrines of Kedarnath and Badrinath, you must start on your pilgrimage from Haridwar, and in order to acquire a full measure of the merits vouchsafed to you for the correct performance of the pilgrimage, you must walk every step of the way from Haridwar to Kedarnath, and thence over the mountain track to Badrinath barefoot. Having purified yourself by immersion in the sacred Harkipori pool, done darshan at the many shrines and temples in Haridwar, and added your mite to their coffers, you must not omit to toss a coin within reach of the festering stumps, which once were hands of the leopards who line the narrowest part of the pilgrim road above the sacred pool. For if you make this omission, they will call down curses on your head. What matter if these unfortunate ones have wealth beyond your dreams, secreted in their filthy rags, or in the rock caves they call their homes? The curses of such as they were best avoided, and immunity will cost you but a few coppers. You have now done all that custom and religion require of a good Hindu, and are at liberty to start on your long and hard pilgrimage. The first place of interest you will come to after leaving Haridwar is Rishikesh. Here you will make your first acquaintance with the Kalakamli Walas, so called because of the black blanket their founder wore, and which many of his disciples still wear, in the form of a habit or loose cloak bound round the middle with a cord of goat's hair, and who are renowned throughout the land for their good deeds. I do not know if any of the other religious brotherhoods you will meet on your pilgrimage have any claim to renown, but I do know that the Kalakamli Walas have such a claim, and justly so, for out of the offerings they receive at their many shrines and temples they have built, and they maintain hospitals, dispensaries, and pilgrim shelters, and they feed the poor and the needy. With Rishikesh behind you, you will come next to Lakshman Chula, where the pilgrim road crosses from the right to the left bank of the Ganges on a suspension bridge. Here, beware of the red monkeys who infest the bridge, for they are even more importune than the leopards of Haridwar, and if you omit to propitiate them with offerings of sweets or parched gram, your passage across the long and narrow bridge is likely to be both difficult and painful. 3 days' journey up the left bank of the Ganges, and you have reached the ancient capital of Garhwal, Srinagar, an historic, religious, and trading center of considerable importance and of great beauty, nestling in a wide open valley surrounded by high mountains. It was here in the year 1805 that the forebears of the Garhwali soldiers, who have fought so gallantly in 2 world wars, made their last and unsuccessful stand against the Gurkha invaders, and it is a matter of great regret to the people of Garhwal that their ancient city of Srinagar, together with the palaces of their kings, was swept away to the last stone by the bursting of the Gohna Lake Dam in 1894. This dam, caused by a landslide in the valley of the Birehi Ganga, a tributary of the Ganges, was 11,000 feet wide at the base, 2,000 feet wide at the summit, and 900 feet high. When it burst, 10 billion cubic feet of water was released in the short space of 6 hours. So well was the bursting of the dam timed that though the flood devastated the valley of the Ganges right down to Haridwar and swept away every bridge, only one family was lost, the members of which had returned to the danger zone after having been forcibly removed from it. From Srinagar, you have to face a stiff climb to Chatikal, which is compensated for by the magnificent views you will get of the Ganges Valley and of the eternal snows above Kedarnath. A day's march from Chatikal, and you see in front of you Gulab Rai, with its row of grass-thatched pilgrim shelters, a one-roomed, stone-built house, and its drinking trough. This big and imposing drinking trough is fed by a tiny crystal-clear stream, which, in summer, is sedately conducted down the mountainside by a series of channels rough-hewn from pine saplings, At other seasons of the year, the water cascades unconfined, and merrily over rocks draped with moss and maidenhair fern, through luxuriant beds of vivid green watercress and sky blue strobilanthes. 100 yards beyond the pilgrim shelters, and on the right-hand side of the road, stands a mango tree. This tree and the two-storied house above it, which is the home of the Pundit who owns the Gulabrai pilgrim shelters, are worthy of note, for they play an important part in the tale I have to tell. Another 2 miles along the last flat bit of ground you will see for many a day you have reached Rudraprayag, where you and I, my pilgrim friend, must part, for your way lies across the Alaknanda and up the left bank of the Mandakini to Kedarnath, while mine lies over the mountains to my home in Nainital. The road in front of you, which has been trodden by the feet of millions of pilgrims like you, is excessively steep and incredibly rough, and you, whose lungs have never breathed air above sea level, you have never climbed anything higher than the roof of your house, and whose feet have never trodden anything harder than yielding sand, will suffer greatly. Times there will be a many when, gasping for breath, you will toil up the face of steep mountains on feet torn and bleeding by passage over rough rocks, sharp shale, and frozen ground, when you will question whether the prospective reward you seek is worth the present price you pay in suffering. But, being a good Hindu, you will toil on, comforting yourself with the thought that merit is not gained without suffering, and the greater the suffering in this world, the greater the reward in the next. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Man-Eater. Prayag is the Hindi word for confluence. At Rudraprayag, 2 rivers, the Mandakini coming down from Kedarnath and the Alaknanda from Badrinath, meet, and from here onwards the combined waters of the 2 rivers are known to all Hindus as Ganga Mai, and to the rest of the world as the Ganges. When an animal, be it a leopard or be it a tiger, becomes a man-eater, it is given a place name for purposes of identification. The name so given to a man-eater does not necessarily imply that the animal began its man-eating career at, or that all of its skills were confined to, that particular place. It is quite natural that the leopard which started its man-eating career at a small village 12 miles from Rudraprayag, on the Kedarnath pilgrim route, should have been known for the rest of its career as the man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag. Leopards do not become man-eaters for the same reasons that tigers do. Though I hate to admit it, our leopards, the most beautiful and the most graceful of all the animals in our jungles, and who, when cornered or wounded, are second to none in courage, are scavengers to the extent that they will, when driven by hunger, eat any dead thing they find in the jungle, just as lions will in the African bush. The people of Garhwal are Hindus, and as such cremate their dead. The cremation invariably takes place on the bank of a stream or river, in order that the ashes may be washed down into the Ganges and eventually into the sea. As most of the villages are situated high up on the hills, while the streams of rivers are in many cases miles away down in the valleys, it will be realized that a funeral entails a considerable tax on the manpower of a small community, when, in addition to the carrying party, labor has to be provided to collect and carry the fuel needed for the cremation. In normal times, these rites are carried out very effectively, but when disease in epidemic form sweeps through the hills, and the inhabitants die faster than they can be disposed of, a very simple rite, which consists of placing a live coal in the mouth of the deceased, is performed in the village, and the body is then carried to the edge of the hill and cast into the valley below. A leopard, in an area in which his natural food is scarce, finding these bodies, very soon acquires a taste for human flesh, and when the disease dies down and normal conditions are re-established, he very naturally, on finding his food supply cut off, takes to killing human beings. In the wave of epidemic influenza that swept through the country in 1918, and that cost India over 1 million lives. Garhwal suffered very severely, and it was at the end of this epidemic that the Garhwal man-eater made his appearance. The first human kill credited to the man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag is recorded as having taken place at Bainji village on 9th of June 1918, and the last kill for which the man-eater was responsible took place at Bhainswara village on 14th of April 1926. Between these two dates, the number of human kills recorded by the government was 125. While I do not think that this figure of 125 is untrue to the extent claimed by government officials who served in Garhwal at that time, and by residents in the area in which the man-eater was operating, I do know that the figure given is not 100% correct, for some kills which took place while I was on the ground have not been shown in the records. In crediting the man-eater with fewer kills than he was actually responsible for, I do not wish to minimize in any way the sufferings endured by the people of Garhwal for 8 long years, nor do I wish to detract in any way from the reputation of the animal which the people of Garhwal claim as having been the most famous man-eating leopard of all time. However be the number of human kills what they may, Garhwal can claim that this leopard was the most publicized animal that has ever lived, for he was mentioned, to my knowledge, in the press of the United Kingdom, America, Canada, South Africa, Kenya, Malaya, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, and in most of the dailies and weeklies of India. In addition to this newspaper publicity, tales of the man-eater were carried to every part of India by the 60,000 pilgrims who annually visit the shrines of Kedarnath and Badrinath. The procedure laid down by government in all cases of human beings alleged to have been killed by man-eaters is for the relatives or friends of the deceased to lodge a report with the village patwari as soon after the occurrence as possible. On receipt of the report, the patwari proceeds to the spot, and if the body of the victim has not been found before his arrival, he organizes a search party and with their aid endeavors to find the victim. If the body has been found before his arrival, or if the search party finds it, the patwari holds an inquiry on the spot, and when satisfied that it is a genuine kill by a man-eater and not a case of murder, he gives the relatives permission to remove the remains for cremation or for burial, according to the caste or creed of the victim. The kill is duly recorded in his register against the man-eater operating in that area, and a full report of occurrence is submitted to the administrative head of the district, the deputy commissioner, who also keeps a register in which all the man-eater's kills are recorded. In the event, however, of the body or any portion of it not being found, as sometimes happens, for man-eaters have an annoying habit of carrying their victims for long distances, the case is held over for further inquiry, and the man-eater is not credited with the kill at all. Again, when people are mauled by a man-eater and subsequently die from their injuries, the man-eater concerned is not credited with their deaths. It will thus be seen that though the system adopted for recording the kills of man-eaters is as good as it can be, it is possible for one of these abnormal animals to be responsible for more human kills than he is finally credited with, especially when his operations extend over a long period of time. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Terror. The word terror is so generally and universally used in connection with everyday trivial matters that it is apt to fail to convey, when intended to do so, its real meaning. I should like, therefore, to give you some idea of what terror, real terror, meant to the 50,000 inhabitants living in the 500 square miles of Garhwal in which the man-eater was operating, and to the 60,000 pilgrims who annually passed through that area between the years 1918 and 1926. And I will give you a few instances to show you what grounds the inhabitants and the pilgrims had for that terror. No curfew order has ever been more strictly enforced and more implicitly obeyed than the curfew imposed by the man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag. During the hours of sunlight, life in that area carried on in a normal way. Men went long distances to the bazaars to transact business, or to outlying villages to visit family or friends. Women went up the mountainsides to cut grass for thatching or for cattle fodder. Children went to school or into the jungles to graze goats or to collect dry sticks. And if it were summer, pilgrims, either singly or in large numbers, toiled along the pilgrim routes on their way to and from the sacred shrines of Kedarnath and Badrinath. As the sun approached the western horizon and the shadows lengthened, the behavior of the entire population of the area underwent a very sudden and a very noticeable change. Men who had sauntered to the bazaars or to outlying villages were hurrying home. Women carrying great bundles of grass were stumbling down the steep mountain sides. Children who had loitered on their way from school or who were late in bringing in their flocks of goats or the dry sticks they had been sent out to collect were being called by anxious mothers, and the weary pilgrims were being urged by any local inhabitant who passed them to hurry to shelter. When night came, an ominous silence brooded over the entire area. No movement and no sound anywhere at all. The entire local population was behind fast-closed doors, and in many cases had sought further protection by building additional doors. Those of the pilgrims who had not been fortunate enough to find accommodation inside homes were huddled close together in pilgrim shelters, and all, whether in house or shelter, were silent for fear of attracting the dread man-eater. This is what terror meant to the people of Garhwal and to the pilgrims for 8 long years. I will now give a few instances to show you what grounds there were for that terror. A boy, an orphan, aged 14, was employed to look after a flock of 40 goats. He was of the depressed, untouchable class, and each evening when he returned with his charges, he was given his food and then shut into a small room with the goats. The room was on the ground floor of a long row of double-storied buildings, and was immediately below the room occupied by the boy's master, the owner of the goats. To prevent the goats crowding in on him as he slept, the boy had fenced off the far left corner of the room. This room had no windows and only one door, and when the boy and the goats were safely inside, the boy's master pulled the door to and fastened it by passing the hasp, which was attached by a short length of chain to the door, over the staple fixed in the lintel. A piece of wood was then inserted in the staple to keep the hasp in place, and on his side of the door the boy, for his better safety, rolled a stone against it. On the night the orphan was gathered to his father's, his master asserts the door was fastened as usual, and I have no reason to question the truth of this assertion. In support of this, the door showed many deep claw marks, and it is possible that in his attempts to claw open the door, the leopard displaced the piece of wood that was keeping the hasp in place, after which it would have been easy for him to push the stone aside and enter the room. 40 goats packed into a small room, one corner of which was fenced off, could not have left the intruder much space to maneuver in, and it is left to conjecture whether the leopard covered the distance from the door to the boy's corner of the room over the backs of the goats or under their bellies, for at this stage of the proceedings all the goats must have been on their feet. It were best to assume that the boy slept through all the noise the leopard must have made when trying to force open the door, and that the goats must have made when the leopard had entered the room, and that he did not cry for help to deaf ears, only screened from him and the danger that menaced him by a thin plank. After killing the boy in the fenced-off corner, the leopard carried him across the empty room. The goats had by this time all escaped into the night down a steep hillside, and then over some terraced fields to a deep boulder-strewn ravine. It was here, after the sun had been up a few hours, that the master found all that the leopard had left of his servant. Incredible as it may seem, not one of the 40 goats had received so much as a scratch. A neighbor had dropped in to spend the period of a long smoke with a friend. The room was L-shaped, and the only door in it was not visible from where the two men sat on the floor with their backs to the wall smoking. The door was shut but not fastened, for up to that night there had been no human kills in the village. The room was in darkness, and the owner of it had just passed the hookah to his friend when it fell to the ground, scattering a shower of burning coals and tobacco. Telling his friend to be more careful, or he would set the blanket on which they were sitting on fire, the man bent forward to gather up the embers, and as he did so, the door came into view. A young moon was near setting, and silhouetted against it, the man saw Leopard carrying his friend through the door. When recounting the incident to me a few days later, the man said, "I am speaking the truth, Sahib, when I tell you I never heard even so much as the intake of a breath or any other sound from my friend who was sitting only an arm's length from me, either when the leopard was killing him or when it was carrying him away. There was nothing I could do for my friend, so I waited until the leopard had gone some little while, and then I crept up to the door and hastily shut and secured it." The wife of the headman of a village was ill from a fever, and 2 friends had been called in to nurse her. There were 2 rooms in the house. The outer room had 2 doors, one opening onto a small flagged courtyard, and the other leading into the inner room. This outer room also had a narrow slip of a window set some 4 feet above floor level, and in this window, which was open, stood a large brass vessel containing drinking water for the sick woman. Except for the one door giving access to the outer room, the inner room had no other opening in any of its 4 walls. The door leading out onto the courtyard was shut and securely fastened, and the door between the 2 rooms was wide open. The 3 women in the inner room were lying on the ground, the sick woman in the middle with a friend on either side of her. The husband in the outer room was on a bed on the side of the room nearest the window, and on the floor beside his bed, where its light would shine into the inner room, was a lantern turned down low to conserve oil. Round about midnight, when the occupants of both the rooms were asleep, the leopard entered by way of the narrow slip of a window, avoiding in some miraculous way knocking over the brass vessel which nearly filled it, skirted round the man's low bed, and entering the inner room, killed the sick woman. It was only when the heavy brass vessel crashed to the floor as the leopard attempted to lift its victim through the window that the sleepers awoke. When the lantern had been turned up, the woman who had been sick was discovered lying huddled up under the window, and in her throat were 4 great teeth marks. A neighbor, whose wife had been one of the nurses on that night, when relating the occurrence to me, said, "The woman was very ill from her fever and was likely to have died in any case, so it was fortunate that the leopard selected her." 2 Gujars were moving their herd of 30 buffaloes from one grazing ground to another, and accompanying them was the 12-year-old daughter of the older of the 2 men, who were brothers. They were strangers to the locality, and either had not heard of the man-eater, or, which is more probable, thought the buffaloes would give them all the protection they needed. Near the road, and at an elevation of 8,000 feet, was a narrow strip of flat ground below which was a sickle-shaped terraced field, some quarter of an acre in extent, which had long been out of cultivation. The men selected this site for their camp, and having cut stakes from the jungle, which surrounded them on all sides, they drove them deep into the field and tethered their buffaloes in a long row. After the evening meal prepared by the girl had been eaten, the party of 3 laid their blankets on the narrow strip of ground between the road and the buffaloes and went to sleep. It was a dark night, and sometime towards the early hours of the morning, the men were awakened by the booming of their buffalo bells and by the snorting of the frightened animals. Knowing from long experience that these sounds indicated the presence of carnivora, the men lit a lantern and went among the buffaloes to quieten them and to see that none had broken the ropes tethering them to these stakes. The men were absent only a few minutes. When they returned to their sleeping place, they found that the girl whom they had left asleep was missing. On the blanket on which she had been lying were big splashes of blood. When daylight came, the father and the uncle followed the blood trail. After skirting round the row of tethered buffaloes, it went across the narrow field and down the steep hillside for a few yards to where the leopard had eaten his kill. My brother was born under an unlucky star, Sahib, for he has no son, and he had only this one daughter, who was to have been married shortly, and to whom he looked in the fullness of time to provide him with an heir, and now the leopard has come and eaten her. I could go on, for there were many kills and each one has its own tragic story, but I think I have said enough to convince you that the people of Garhwal had ample reason to be terrified of the man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag, especially when it is remembered that Garhwalis are intensely superstitious and that, added to their fear of physical contact with the leopard, was their even greater fear of the supernatural, of which I shall give you one example. I set out from the small one-room Rudraprayag inspection bungalow one morning just as day was breaking, and as I stepped off the veranda, I saw in the dust, where the ground had been worn away by human feet, the pug marks of the man-eater. The pug marks were perfectly fresh and showed that the leopard had stepped out of the veranda only a few minutes in advance of me, and from the direction in which they were pointing, it was evident that the leopard, after his fruitless visit to the bungalow, was making for the pilgrim road some 50 yards away. Tracking between the bungalow and the road was not possible, owing to the hard surface of the ground, but as I reached the gate, I saw the pug marks were heading in the direction of Golabrai. A large flock of sheep and goats had gone down the road the previous evening, and in the dust they had kicked up the leopard's tracks showed up as clearly as they would have on fresh fallen snow. I had by then become quite familiar with the man-eater's pug marks and could with little difficulty have distinguished them from the pug marks of any 100 leopards. A lot can be learned from the pug marks of carnivora, as for instance the sex, age, and size of the animal. I had examined the pug marks of the man-eater very carefully the first time I had seen them, and I knew he was an outsized male leopard long past his prime. As I followed the tracks of the man-eater on this morning, I could see that he was only a few minutes ahead of me and that he was moving at a slow, even pace. The road, which had no traffic on it at this early hour of the morning, wound in and out of a number of small ravines, and as it was possible that the leopard might on this occasion break his rule of never being out after daylight, I crept round each corner with the utmost care until I found, a mile farther on, where the leopard had left the road and gone up a great track into dense scrub and tree jungle. 100 yards from where the leopard had left the road, there was a small field, in the center of which was a thorn enclosure, erected by the owner of the field to encourage packmen to camp there and fertilize it. In this enclosure was the flock of sheep and goats that had come down the road the previous evening. The owner of the flock, a rugged fellow who by the looks of him had been packing trade commodities up and down the pilgrim road for nigh on half a century, and was just removing the thorn bush closing the entrance to the enclosure when I came up. In reply to my inquiries, he informed me that he had seen nothing of the leopard, but that just as dawn was breaking, his 2 sheepdogs had given tongue, and a few minutes later the cocker had barked in the jungle above the road. When I asked the old packman if he would sell me one of his goats, he asked for what purpose it was wanted, and when I told him it was to tie up for the man-eater, he walked through the opening in the fence, replaced the bush, accepted one of my cigarettes, and sat down on a rock by the side of the road. We remained smoking for a while, with my question still unanswered, and then the man began to talk. "You, Sahib, are undoubtedly he whom I have heard tell of on my way down from my village near Badrinath, and it grieves me that you should have come all this long way from your home on a fruitless errand. The evil spirit that is responsible for all the human deaths in this area is not an animal, as you think it is, that can be killed by ball or shot, or by any of the other means that you have tried, and that others have tried before you. And in proof of what I will say, I will tell you a story while I smoke this second cigarette. The story was told to me by my father, who, as everyone knows, had never been heard to tell a lie. My father was a young man then, and I unborn when an evil spirit, like the one that is now troubling this land, made its appearance in our village, and all said it was a leopard. Men, women, and children were killed in their homes, and every effort was made, as has been made here, to kill the animal. Traps were set, and far famed marksmen sat in trees and fired ball and shot at the leopard, and when all these attempts to kill it had failed, a great terror seized the people, and none dared leave the shelter of his home between the hours of sunset and sunrise. And then the headman of my father's village, and of the villages round about, bade all the men attend a panchayat, and when all were assembled, the Panch addressed the meeting, and said they were assembled to devise some fresh means to rid themselves of this man-eating leopard. Then an old man, fresh back from the burning ghat, whose grandson had been killed the previous night, arose and said it was no leopard that had entered his house and killed his grandson as he lay asleep by his side, but one from among their own community, who, when he craved for human flesh and blood, assumed the semblance of a leopard, and that such a one could not be killed by the methods already tried, as had been amply proved, and could only be killed by fire. His suspicions, he said, fell on the fat sadhu who lived in the hut near the ruined temple. At this there was a great uproar, some exclaiming that the old man's sorrow at the loss of his grandson had demented him, others averring he was right, and these later recalled that the sadhu had arrived at the village at about the time the killings had started. And it was further recalled that on the day succeeding a killing, the sadhu had been seen to sleep all day, stretched on his bed in the sun. When order had been restored, the matter was long debated, and the panchayat eventually decided that no immediate action would be taken, but that the sadhu's movements should in future be watched closely. The assembled men were then divided into 3 parties. The first party to start its watch from the night the next kill could be expected, for the kills had taken place at more or less regular intervals. During the nights, the first and the second parties were on watch. The sadhu did not leave his hut. My father was with the third party, and at nightfall he silently took up his position. Soon after, the door of the hut slowly opened, and the sadhu emerged and vanished into the night. Some hours later, an agonized scream came floating down on the night air from the direction of a charcoal burner's hut far up the mountainside, and thereafter there was silence. No man of my father's party closed an eye that night, and as the grey dawn was being born in the east, they saw the sadhu hurrying home, and his hands and his mouth were dripping with blood. When the sadhu had gone inside his hut and had closed the door, the watchers went up to it and fastened it from the outside, by passing the chain that was dangling from it over the staple in the lintel. Then they went each to his haystack and returned with a big bundle of straw, and when the sun rose that morning, there was nothing but smouldering ash where the hut had been. From that day the killing stopped. Suspicion has not yet fallen on any one of the many sadhus in these parts, but when it does, the method employed in my father's time will be adopted in mine, and until that day comes, the people of Garhwal must suffer. You have asked if I will sell you a goat. I will not sell you a goat, Sahib, for I have none to spare. But if, after hearing my story, you still want an animal to tie up for what you think is a man-eating leopard, I will lend you one of my sheep. If it is killed, you shall pay me its price, and if it is not killed, no money shall pass between us. Today and tonight I rest here, and tomorrow at the rising of the Bhutia star I must be on my way. Near sundown that evening I returned to the thorn enclosure, and my packman friend very cheerfully let me select from his flock a fat sheep, which I considered was heavy enough to give the leopard 2 nights' feed. This sheep I tied in the scrub jungle close to the path up which the leopard had gone some 12 hours earlier. Next morning I was up betimes. As I left the bungalow, I again saw the pug marks of the man-eater, where he had stopped off the veranda, and at the gate I found he had come up the road from the direction of Golabrai, and, after calling at the bungalow, had gone away towards the Rudraprayag bazaar. The fact that the leopard was trying to secure a human kill was proof that he had no interest in the sheep I had provided for him, and I was therefore not surprised to find that he had not eaten any portion of the sheep, which he had apparently killed shortly after I had tied it up. "Go back to your home, Sahib, and save your time and your money," was the parting advice of the old packman as he whistled to his flock and headed down the road for Haridwar. A parallel case, happily without as tragic an ending, occurred a few years previously near Rudraprayag. Incensed at the killing of their relatives and friends, and convinced that a human being was responsible for their deaths, an angry crowd of men seized an unfortunate sadhu of Kotki village, Das Julapatti, but before they were able to wreak their vengeance on him, Philip Mason, then Deputy Commissioner of Garhwal, who was camping in the vicinity, arrived on the scene. Seeing the temper of the crowd, and being a man of great experience, Mason said he had no doubt that the real culprit had been apprehended, but that before the sadhu was lynched, justice demanded that his guilt should be established. To this end he suggested that the sadhu should be placed under arrest and closely guarded night and day. To this suggestion the crowd agreed, and for 7 days and 7 nights the sadhu was carefully guarded by the police and is carefully watched by the populace. On the 8th morning, when the guard and the watchers were being changed, word was brought that a house in a village some miles away had been broken into the previous night and a man carried off. The populace raised no objection to the sadhu being released that day, contenting themselves by saying that on this occasion the wrong man had been apprehended, but that next time no mistake would be made. In Garhwal, all kills by man-eaters are attributed to sadhus, and in Nainital and Almora districts all such kills are attributed to the Boksars, who dwell in the unhealthy belt of grass at the foot of the hills called the Terai, living chiefly on game. The sadhus are believed to kill for the lust of human flesh and blood, and the Boksars are believed to kill for the jewelry their victims are wearing or for other valuables they have on their person. More women than men have been killed by man-eaters in Nainital and Almora districts, but for this there is a better reason than the one given. I have lived too long in silent places to be imaginative. Even so, there were times a many during the months I spent at Rudraprayag, sitting night after night, on one occasion for 28 nights in succession, watching bridges or crossroads or approaches to villages or over animal or human kills, when I could imagine the man-eater as being a big, light-colored animal, for so he had appeared to me the first time that I saw him, with the body of a leopard and the head of a fiend, who, while watching me through the long night hours, rocked and rolled with silent, fiendish laughter at my vain attempts to outwit him, and licked his lips in anticipation of the time when, finding me off guard for one brief moment, he would get the opportunity he was waiting for of burying his teeth in my throat. It may be asked what the government was doing all the years the Rudraprayag man-eater menaced the people of Garhwal. I hold no brief for the government, but after having spent 10 weeks on the ground, during which time I walked many hundreds of miles and visited most of the villages in the affected area, I assert that the government did everything in its power to remove the menace. Rewards were offered. The local population believed they amounted to 10,000 rupees in cash, and the gift of 2 villages, sufficient inducement to make each one of the 4,000 licensed gun holders of Garhwal a prospective slayer of the man-eater. Picked shikaris were employed on liberal wages and were promised special rewards if their efforts were successful. More than 300 special gun licenses over and above the 4,000 in force were granted for the specific purpose of shooting the man-eater. Men of the Garhwal regiments stationed in Lansdowne were permitted to take their rifles with them when going home on leave, or were provided with sporting arms by their officers. Appeals were made through the press to sportsmen all over India to assist in the destruction of the leopard. Scores of traps of the drop-door type with goats as bait were erected on approaches to villages and on roads frequented by the man-eater. Patwaris and other government officials were supplied with poison for the purpose of poisoning human kills, and last but not the least, government servants, often at great personal risk, spent all the time they could spare from their official duties in pursuit of the man-eater. The total results from all these many and combined efforts were a slight gunshot wound which creased the pad of the leopard's left hind foot and shot away a small piece of skin from one of its toes, and an entry in government records by the Deputy Commissioner of Garhwal that, so far from suffering any ill effects, the leopard appeared to thrive on and be stimulated by the poison he absorbed via human kills. 3 interesting incidents are recorded in a government report, and I will summarize them here. First, in response to the press appeal to sportsmen, 2 young British officers arrived at Rudraprayag in 1921 with the avowed object of shooting the man-eater. What reason they had for thinking that the leopard crossed from bank to bank of the Alaknanda River by the Rudraprayag suspension bridge, I do not know. Anyway, they decided to confine their efforts to this bridge and shoot the leopard as it was crossing at night. There are towers at each end of the bridge to carry the suspending cables, so one of the young sportsmen sat on the tower on the left bank of the river, and his companion sat on the tower on the right bank. After they had been sitting for 2 months on these towers, the man on the left bank saw the leopard walk out onto the bridge from the archway below him. Waiting until the leopard had got well onto the bridge, he fired, and as it dashes across, the man on the tower on the right bank emptied the 6 chambers of his revolver at it. Next morning, blood was found on the bridge and up on the hill on which the leopard had gone, and as it was thought that the wound or wounds would be fatal, a search was kept up for many days. The report goes on to say that for 6 months after it was wounded, the leopard did not kill any human beings. I was told about this incident by men who had heard the 7 shots and who had assisted in trying to recover the wounded animal. It was thought by the 2 sportsmen and also by my informants that the leopard had been hit in the back by the first bullet and possibly in the head by some of the subsequent bullets, and it was for this reason that a diligent and prolonged search had been made for it. From the particulars given to me of the blood trail, I was of opinion that the sportsmen were wrong in thinking that they had inflicted a body and head wound on the leopard, for the blood trail as described to me could only have been made by a foot wound, and I was very gratified to find later that my deductions were correct and that the bullet fired by the man on the tower on the left bank had only creased the pad of the leopard's left hind foot and shot away a portion of one of its toes, and that the man on the right bank had missed all of his shots altogether. Second, after some 20 leopards had been caught and killed in traps of the drop-door type, a leopard which everyone thought was the man-eater was caught in one of these traps, and as the Hindu population was unwilling to kill it for fear the spirits of the people whom the man-eater had killed would torment them, an Indian Christian was sent for. This Christian was living in a village 30 miles away, and before he could arrive on the scene, the leopard had dug its way out of the trap and escaped. Third, after killing a man, the leopard lay up with its kill in a small isolated patch of jungle. Next morning, when search was being made for the victim, the leopard was detected leaving the jungle. After a short chase, it was seen to enter a cave, the mouth of which was promptly closed with thorn bushes heaped over with big rocks. Every day, a growing crowd of men visited the spot. On the 5th day, when some 500 were assembled, a man whose name is not given but whom the report describes as a man of influence came and, to quote the report, said scornfully, "There is no leopard in this cave," and took the thorns off the cave. As he took the thorns up, the leopard suddenly rushed out of the cave and made his way safely through a crowd of some 500 people who had gathered there. These incidents took place shortly after the leopard had become a man-eater, and had the leopard been killed on the bridge, shot in the trap, or sealed up in the cave, several hundred people need not have died, and Garhwal would have been saved many years of suffering. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Arrival. It was during one of the intervals of Gilbert and Sullivan's Yeomen of the Guard, which was showing at the Chalet Theatre in Nainital in 1925, that I first had any definite news of the Rudraprayag man-eater. I had heard casually that there was a man-eating leopard in Garhwal, and had read articles in the press about the animal, but knowing that there were over 4,000 licensed gunholders in Garhwal, and a host of keen sportsmen in Lansdowne, only some 70 miles from Rudraprayag, I imagined that people were falling over each other in their eagerness to shoot the leopard, and that a stranger under these circumstances would not be welcome. It was with no little surprise, therefore, that as I stood at the chalet bar that night having a drink with a friend, I heard Michael Keane, then Chief Secretary to the Government of the United Provinces, and later Governor of Assam, telling a group of men about the man-eater and trying to persuade them to go after it. His appeal, judging from the remarks of one of the group and endorsed by the others, was not received with any enthusiasm. The remark was, "Go after a man-eater that has killed 100 people? Not on your life." Next morning I paid Michael Keane a visit, and got all the particulars I wanted. He was not able to tell me exactly where the man-eater was operating, and suggested my going to Rudraprayag and getting in touch with Ibbotson. On my return home I found a letter from Ibbotson on my table. Ibbotson, now Sir William Ibbotson, and lately advisor to the Governor of the United Provinces, had very recently been posted into Garhwal as Deputy Commissioner, and one of his first acts had been to try to rid his district of the man-eater. It was in this connection that he had written to me. My preparations were soon made, and by travelling via Ranikhet, Al-Badri, and Karanprayag, I arrived on the evening of the 10th day at a road inspection bungalow near Nagrasu. When leaving Nainital, I did not know it was necessary to arm myself with a permit to occupy this bungalow, and as the caretaker had orders not to allow anyone to occupy it unless so armed, the 6 Garhwalis carrying my kit, my servant, and I toiled on for another 2 miles down the Rudraprayag road until we found a suitable place on which to camp for the night. While my men busied themselves getting water and dry sticks, and my servant collected stones for a cooking place, I picked up an axe and went to cut down thorn bushes to make an enclosure to protect us during the night, for we had been warned 10 miles farther up the road that we had entered the man-eater's territory. Shortly after the fires to cook our evening meal had been lit, a very agitated call came down to us from a village far up the mountainside, asking us what we were doing out in the open, and warning us that if we remained where we were, one or more of us would surely be killed by the man-eater. When the Good Samaritan had delivered his warning, to do which he had possibly taken a great risk, for it was dark, Madhu Singh, whom you have met elsewhere, expressed the wishes of all present when he said, "We will stay here, Sahib, for there is sufficient oil in the lantern to keep it alight all night, and you have your rifle." There was sufficient oil in the lantern to keep it alight all night, for I found it burning when I woke in the morning, and my loaded rifle lay across my bed. But the thorn enclosure was very flimsy, and we were dead tired after our 10 days' march, and if the leopard had paid us a visit that night, he would have secured a very easy victim. Next day, we arrived at Rudraprayag and were given a warm welcome by the men whom Ibbotson had instructed to meet us. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Investigation. I shall not attempt to give you a day-by-day account of my activities during the 10 weeks I spent at Rudraprayag, for it would be difficult after this lapse of time to write such an account, and if written, it would be boring for you to read. I shall confine myself to relating a few of my experiences, sometimes while alone, and at other times in company with Ibbotson. But before doing so, I should like to give you some idea of the country over which the leopard ranged for 8 years and in which I hunted him for 10 weeks. If you were to climb the hill to the east of Rudraprayag, you would be able to see the greater portion of the 500 square miles of country that the Rudraprayag man-eater ranged over. This area is divided into two more or less equal parts by the Alaknanda river, which, after passing Karanprayag, flows south to Rudraprayag, where it is met by the Mandakini river coming down from the northwest. The triangular bit of country between the two rivers is less steep than the country along the left bank of the Alaknanda, and there are consequently more villages in the former area than in the latter. From your elevated position, the cultivated land in the distance shows up as a series of lines drawn across the face of the steep mountains. These lines are terraced fields, which vary in width from a yard to, in some cases, 50 or more yards. The village buildings, you will note, are invariably set at the upper end of this cultivated land. This is done with the object of overlooking and protecting the cultivation from stray cattle and wild animals, for except in very rare cases there are no hedges or fences around the fields. The brown and the green patches that make up most of the landscape are, respectively, grassland and forests. Some of the villages, you will observe, are entirely surrounded by grasslands, while others are entirely surrounded by forests. The whole country, as you look down on it, is rugged and rough, and is cut up by innumerable deep ravines and rock cliffs. In this area there are only two roads, one starting from Rudraprayag and going up to Kedarnath, and the other, the main pilgrim road to Badrinath. Both roads, up to the time I am writing about, were narrow and rough and had never had a wheel of any kind on them. The number of human beings killed between 1918 and 1926 is shown on the next page. It would be reasonable to assume that more human beings would have been killed in villages surrounded by forests than in villages surrounded by cultivated land. Had the man-eater been a tiger, this would undoubtedly have been the case. But to a man-eating leopard, which only operates at night, the presence or absence of cover makes no difference, and the only reason why there were more kills in one village than in another was due in the one case to lack of precautions and in the other to the observance of them. I have mentioned the man-eater was an outsized male leopard, long past his prime, but though he was old, he was enormously strong. The ability of carnivora to carry their kills to a place where they can feed undisturbed determines to a great extent the place they choose to do their killing. To the man-eater, all places were alike, for he was capable of carrying the heaviest of his human victims for distances of up to, on one occasion that I know of, 4 miles. On the occasion I refer to, the leopard had killed a fully grown man in his own house and carried his victim for 2 miles up the steep slope of a well-wooded hill and down the far side for another 2 miles through dense scrub jungle. This was done for no apparent reason, for the kill had taken place in the early hours of the night and the leopard had not been followed up until noon of the next day. Leopards, other than man-eaters, are the most easily killed of all animals in our jungles, for they have no sense of smell. More methods are employed in killing leopards than are employed in killing any other animal. These methods vary according to whether the leopard is being killed for sport or for profit. The most exciting and the most interesting method of killing leopards for sport is to track them down in the jungles and when they are located, stalk and shoot them. The easiest and the most cruel method of killing leopards for profit is to insert a small and a very highly explosive bomb in the flesh of an animal which has been killed by a leopard. Many villagers have learned to make these bombs, and when one of them comes in contact with the leopard's teeth, it explodes and blows the leopard's jaws off. Death is instantaneous in some cases, but more often than not, the unfortunate animal crawls away to die a lingering and a very painful death, for the people who use the bombs have not the courage to follow the blood trail left by the leopard to dispatch it. The tracking, locating, and stalking of leopards, besides being exciting and interesting, is comparatively easy. For leopards have tender pads and keep to footpaths and game tracks as far as possible. They are not hard to locate, for practically every bird and animal in the jungle assists the hunter, and they are easy to stalk, for though they are blessed with very keen sight and hearing, they are handicapped by having no sense of smell. The sportsman can therefore select the line of approach that best suits him, irrespective of the direction in which the wind is blowing. Having tracked, located, and stalked a leopard, far more pleasure is got from pressing the button of a camera than is ever got from pressing the trigger of a rifle. In the one case, the leopard can be watched for hours, and there is no more graceful and interesting animal in the jungles to watch. The button of the camera can be pressed as fancy dictates to make a record which never loses its interest. In the other case, a fleeting glimpse, one press of the trigger, and, if the aim has been true, the acquisition of a trophy which soon loses both its beauty and its interest. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The First Kill. Shortly before my arrival at Rudraprayag, Ibbotson had organized a beat, which, if it had been successful, would have saved the lives of 15 human beings. The beat and the circumstances leading up to it are worthy of record. 20 pilgrims toiling up the road to Badrinath arrived towards evening at a small roadside shop. After the shopkeeper had met their wants, he urged them to be on their way, telling them there was only just sufficient daylight left for them to reach the pilgrim shelters 4 miles farther up the road, where they would get some food and safe shelter. The pilgrims were unwilling to accept this advice. They said that they had done a long march that day and were too tired to walk another 4 miles, and all they wanted were facilities to prepare and cook their evening meal and permission to sleep on the platform adjoining the shop. To this proposal the shopkeeper vigorously objected to. He told the pilgrims that his house was frequently visited by the man-eater, and that to sleep out in the open would be to court death. While the argument was at its height, a sadhu on his way from Mathura to Badrinath arrived on the scene and championed the cause of the pilgrims. He said that if the shopkeeper would give shelter to the women of the party, he would sleep on the platform with the men, and if any leopard, man-eater, or otherwise dared to molest them, he would take it by the mouth and tear it in half. To this proposal the shopkeeper had perforce to agree. So while the 10 women of the party took shelter in the one-roomed shop behind a locked door, the 10 men lay down in a row on the platform with the sadhu in the middle. When the pilgrims on the platform awoke in the morning, they found the sadhu missing, the blanket on which he had slept rumpled, and the sheet he had used to cover himself with partly dragged off the platform and spotted with blood. At the sound of the men's excited chattering, the shopkeeper opened the door and at a glance saw what had happened. When the sun had risen, the shopkeeper, accompanied by the men, followed the blood trail down the hill and across the 3 terraced fields to a low boundary wall. Here, lying across the wall with the lower portion of his body eaten away, they found the sadhu. Ibbotson was staying at Rudraprayag at this time, trying to get in touch with the man-eater. There had been no kills during his stay, so he decided to beat on spec a very likely-looking bit of cover on the far side of the Alaknanda, which the locals suspected was used by the man-eater as a lying-off place during the hours of daylight. So while the 20 pilgrims were toiling up the road towards the little shop, the patwaris and other members of Ibbotson's staff were going round the nearby villages, warning men to be ready for the beat which was to take place on the morrow. After an early breakfast next morning, Ibbotson, accompanied by his wife and a friend whose name I have forgotten, and followed by some members of his staff and 200 beaters, crossed the Alaknanda by the suspension bridge, went up the hill on the far side for a mile or so, and took up positions for the beat. While the beat was still in progress, word was brought by runner of the killing of the sadhu. The beat, which proved to be a blank, was completed and a hurried council held, the upshot of which was that Ibbotson, his party, and the 200 beaters set off up the right bank to cross the river 4 miles farther up by a swing bridge, to make their way back along the left bank to the scene of the kill, while the staff dispersed over the countryside to collect as many men as possible and assemble them at the shop. By late afternoon 2,000 beaters and several additional guns had gathered, and the high rugged hill above the shop was beaten from top to bottom. If you know Ibbotson, there is no need for me to tell you that the beat was very efficiently organized and as efficiently carried out, and the only reason why it failed in its object was that the leopard was not in the area. When a leopard or a tiger leaves of its own accord a kill in the open in an exposed spot, it is an indication that the animal has no further interest in the kill. After its feed, it invariably removes itself to a distance, maybe only 2 or 3 miles, or in the case of man-eaters, maybe to a distance of 10 or more miles. So it is quite possible that while the hill was being beaten, the man-eater was peacefully slumbering 10 miles away. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Locating the Leopard. Man-eating leopards are of rare occurrence, and for this reason very little is known about them. My own experience of these animals was very limited, amounting to no more than a brief encounter with one many years previously. And though I suspected that the changeover from animal to human and animal diet would affect the habits of a leopard as much as it does those of a tiger, I did not know to what extent a leopard's habits would change, and meanwhile I decided to try to kill the man-eater by the methods usually employed for killing leopards. The most common method of killing leopards is to set up for them, either over a kill or over live bait in the form of a goat or a sheep. To carry out either one of these methods, it is necessary, in the one case to find a kill and in the other to locate the quarry. My object in going to Rudraprayag was to try to prevent further loss of human life, and I had no intention of waiting for another human kill to occur over which I could sit. Therefore, the obvious thing to do was to locate the man-eater and shoot it over live bait. Here, a formidable difficulty, which I hoped in time partly to overcome, presented itself. From the maps I had been supplied with, I found that the man-eater was operating over an area of roughly 500 square miles. 500 square miles of country anywhere would have been a considerable area in which to find and shoot any animal, and in this mountainous and rugged part of Garhwal, the task of finding an animal that only operated at night appeared at first glance to be, well, nigh impossible, until I took the Alaknanda River, which divided the area into 2 or more equal parts, into consideration. It was generally believed that the Alaknanda offered no obstacle to the man-eater, and that when he found it difficult to obtain a human kill on one bank, he crossed over to the other bank by swimming the river. I discounted this belief. No leopard, in my opinion, would under any circumstances voluntarily commit itself to the swift-flowing, ice-cold waters of the Alaknanda, and I was convinced that when the man-eater crossed from one bank to the other, he did so by one of the 2 suspension bridges. Of the 2 suspension bridges in the area, one was at Rudraprayag, and the other about 12 miles farther up the river at Chatwa People. Between these 2 bridges there was a swing bridge, the one by which Ibbotson, his party, and the 200 men had crossed the river on the day of the beat. This swing bridge, which no animal excepting a rat could possibly have crossed, was the most fear-compelling structure of its kind that I have ever seen. The 2 hand-twisted grass cables, blackened by age and mouldy from the mists rising from the river, spanned some 200 feet of foaming white water which, 100 yards farther down, surged with a roar like thunder between 2 walls of rock, where a kakur, driven by wild dogs, is credited with having leapt across the Alaknanda. Between the cables and forming the footway were odd bits of sticks 1.5 inches to 2 inches in diameter, set about 2 feet apart and loosely tied to the cables with wisps of grass. To add to the difficulty in crossing this cobweb structure, one of the cables had sagged, with the result that the sticks on which one had to place one's feet were at an angle of 45 degrees. The first time I met this fearsome chula, I was foolish enough to ask the toll collector, who for the payment of 1 paise permitted me to risk my life on it, whether the bridge was ever tested or repaired. His answer, given as he ran a speculative eye over me, that the bridge was never tested or repaired, but was replaced when it broke under the weight of someone who was trying to cross it, gave me a cold feeling down my spine, a feeling that remained with me long after I had got safely to the other side. This chula being beyond the powers of the man-eater to cross, there remained the 2 suspension bridges, and I felt sure that if I could choose them against the leopard, I should be able to confine him to one side of the Alaknanda, and so reduce by half the area in which to look for him. The first thing, therefore, was to try to find out on which bank of the river the leopard was. The last kill of the sadhu had taken place on the left bank of the river, a few miles from the Chatwa people's suspension bridge, and I felt sure that the leopard had crossed this bridge after abandoning his kill, for no matter what precautions the locals and the pilgrims may have taken before a kill, their precautions were redoubled immediately after one, and made it almost impossible for the leopard to secure consecutive kills in the same area. Looking at the map, you will ask why, if this was so, as many as 6 kills have been shown against a single village. I can only answer that an effort cannot be sustained indefinitely. The houses are small and without conveniences or means of sanitation, and it would not be surprising if, hearing the man-eater was operating in a village 10, 15, or 20 miles away, some man, woman, or child should, at the urgent dictate of nature, open a door for a brief minute, and so give the leopard the chance for which he had perhaps been waiting many nights. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Second Kill. No photographs or other means by which I could identify the man-eater by his pug marks were available, so until I had been given an opportunity of acquiring this information for myself, I decided to treat all leopards in the vicinity of Rudraprayag as suspect and to shoot any that gave me a chance. The day I arrived at Rudraprayag, I purchased 2 goats. One of these I tied up the following evening a mile along the pilgrim road. The other I took across the Alaknanda and tied up on a path running through some heavy scrub jungle, where I found the old pug marks of a big male leopard. On visiting the goats the following morning, I found the one across the river had been killed and a small portion of it eaten. The goat had unquestionably been killed by a leopard, but had been eaten by a small animal, possibly a pine marten. Having received no news about the man-eater during the day, I decided to sit up over the goat, and at 3 p.m. took up my position in the branches of a small tree about 50 yards from the kill. During the 3 hours that I sat in the tree, I had no indication from either animals or birds that the leopard was anywhere in the vicinity, and as dusk was falling, I slipped off the tree, cut the cord tethering the goat, which the leopard had made no attempt to break the previous night, and set off for the bungalow. I have already admitted that I had very little previous experience of man-eating leopards, but I had met a few man-eating tigers, and from the time I left the tree until I reached the bungalow, I took every precaution to guard against a sudden attack, and it was fortunate that I did so. I made an early start next morning, and near the gate of the bungalow I picked up the tracks of a big male leopard. These tracks I followed back to a densely wooded ravine which crossed the path close to where the goat was lying. The goat had not been touched during the night. The leopard that had followed me could only have been the man-eater, and for the rest of the day I walked as many miles as my legs would carry me, telling all the people in the villages I visited, and all of whom I met on the roads, that the man-eater was on our side of the river, and warning them to be careful. Nothing happened that day, but next day, just as I was finishing breakfast after a long morning spent in prospecting the jungles beyond Golabrai, a very agitated man dashed into the bungalow to tell me that a woman had just been killed by the man-eater the previous night in a village on the hill above the bungalow, the same hill and almost at the exact same spot from where you obtain your bird's eye view of the 500 square miles of country the man-eater was operating over. Within a few minutes, I collected all the things I needed: a spare rifle and a shotgun, cartridges, rope, and a length of fishing line, and set off up the steep hill accompanied by the villager and 2 of my men. It was such a sultry day, and though the distance was not great, 3 miles at the most, the climb of 4,000 feet in the hot sun was very trying, and I arrived in the village in a bath of sweat. The story of the husband of the woman who had been killed was soon told. After their evening meal, which had been eaten by the light of the fire, the woman collected the metal pots and pans that had been used and carried them to the door to wash, while the man sat down to have a smoke. On reaching the door, the woman sat down on the doorstep, and as she did so, the utensils clattered to the ground. There was not sufficient light for the man to see what had happened, and when he received no answer to his urgent call, he dashed forward and shut and barred the door. "Of what use," he said, "would it have been for me to risk my life in trying to recover a dead body, Sahib?" His logic was sound, though heartless, and I gathered that the grief he showed was occasioned not so much by the loss of his wife as by the loss of that son and heir whom he had expected to be born within the next few days. The door, where the woman had been seized, opened on to a 4-foot wide lane that ran for 50 yards between 2 rows of houses. On hearing the clatter of the falling pots and pans, followed by the urgent call of the man to his wife, every door in the lane had been instantaneously shut. The marks on the ground showed that the leopard had dragged the unfortunate woman the length of the lane, then killed her and carried her down the hill for 100 yards into a small ravine that bordered some terraced fields. Here he ate his meal, and here he left the pitiful remains. The body lay in the ravine at one end of a narrow terraced field, at the other end of which, 40 yards away, was a leafless and stunted walnut tree in whose branches a hayrick had been built, 4 feet from the ground and 6 feet tall. In this hayrick I decided to sit. Starting from near the body, a narrow path ran down into the ravine. On this path were the pug marks of the leopard that had killed the woman, and they were identical with the pug marks of the leopard that had followed me 2 nights previously from the killed goat to the Rudraprayag bungalow. The pug marks were of an outsized male leopard, long past his prime, with a slight defect where a bullet fired 4 years previously had creased the pad of his left hind paw. I procured 2 stout 8-foot bamboos from the village, and drove them into the ground close to the perpendicular bank that divided the field where the body was laying from the field below. To these bamboos I fixed my spare rifle and shotgun securely, tied lengths of dressed silk fishing line to the triggers, looped the lines back over the trigger guards, and fastened them to 2 stakes driven into the hillside on the far side off and a little above the path. If the leopard came along the path he had used the previous night, there was a reasonable chance of his pulling on the lines and shooting himself. On the other hand, if he avoided them or came by any other way, and I fired at him while he was on the kill, he would be almost certain to run into the trap which lay on his most natural line of retreat. Both the leopard, because of its protective coloring, and the body which had been stripped of all clothing, would be invisible in the dark. So, to give me an idea of the direction in which to fire, I took a slab of white rock from the ravine and put it on the edge of the field about a foot from the near side of the body. My ground arrangements completed to my satisfaction, I made myself a comfortable seat on the rick, throwing out some of the straw and heaping some behind me and up to my waist in front. As I was facing the kill and had my back to the tree, there was little chance of the leopard seeing me, no matter at what time he came, and that he would come during the night in spite of his reputation of not returning to his kills, I was firmly convinced. My clothes were still wet after the stiff climb, but a comparatively dry jacket kept out the chill wind, so I settled down into my soft and comfortable seat and prepared for an all-night vigil. I sent my men away, and I told them to remain in the headman's house until I came for them, or until the sun was well up next morning. The sun was near setting, and the view of the Ganges valley, with the snowy Himalayas in the background showing bluish pink under the level rays of the setting sun, was a feast for the eyes. Almost before I realized it, daylight had faded out of the sky, and night had come. Darkness, when used in connection with night, is a relative term, and has no fixed standard. What to one man would be pitch dark, to another would be dark, and to a third, moderately dark. To me, having spent so much of my life in the open, the night is never dark, unless the sky is overcast with heavy clouds. I do not wish to imply that I can see as well by night as by day, but I can see quite well enough to find my way through any jungle, or for that matter, over any ground. I had placed the white stone near the body only as a precaution, for I hoped that the starlight, with the added reflection from the snowy range, would give me sufficient light to shoot by. But my luck was running out, for night had hardly fallen when there was a flash of lightning, followed by distant thunder, and in a few minutes the sky was heavily overcast. Just as the big first drops of a deluge began to fall, I heard a stone roll into the ravine, and a minute later the loose straw on the ground below me was being scratched up. The leopard had arrived, and while I sat in torrential rain with the icy cold wind whistling through my wet clothes, he lay dry and snug in the straw below. The storm was one of the worst I have ever experienced, and while it was still at its height, I saw a lantern being carried towards the village, and marveled at the courage of the man who carried it. It was not until some hours later that I learned that the man who so gallantly braved both the leopard and the storm had done a forced march of over 30 miles from Pauri to bring me the electric night shooting light the government had promised me. The arrival of this light 3 short hours earlier might... But regrets are vain. And who can say that the 14 people who died later would have had a longer span of life if the leopard had not buried his teeth in their throats? And again, even if the light had arrived in time, there is no certainty that I should have killed the leopard that night. The rain was soon over, leaving me chilled to the bone, and the clouds were breaking up when the white stone was suddenly obscured, and a little later I heard the leopard eating. The night before he had lain in the ravine and eaten from that side, and so, expecting him to do the same this night, I had placed the stone on the near side of the kill. Obviously, the rain had formed little pools in the ravine, and to avoid them the leopard had taken up a new position, and in doing so had obscured my mark. This was something I had not foreseen. However, knowing the habits of leopards, I knew I should not have to wait long before the stone showed up again. 10 minutes later the stone was visible, and almost immediately thereafter I heard a sound below me and saw the leopard as a light yellowish object disappearing under the rick. His light color could be accounted for by old age, but the sound he made when walking I could not then, nor can I now, account for. It was like the soft rustle of a woman's silk dress, and could not be explained by stubble in the field, for there was none, or by the loose straw lying about. Waiting a suitable length of time, I raised the rifle and covered the stone, intending to fire the moment it was again obscured. But there is a limit to the time a heavy rifle can be held to the shoulder, and when the limit had been reached, I lowered the rifle to ease my aching muscles. I had hardly done so when the stone for the second time disappeared from view. 3 times within the next 2 hours the same thing happened, and in desperation, as I heard the leopard approaching the rick for the 4th time, I leant over and fired at the indistinct object below me. The narrow terrace, to which I have given the usual name of field, was only about 2 feet wide at this point, and when I examined the ground next morning I found my bullet hole in the center of the 2-foot wide space, with a little hair cut from the leopard's neck scattered round it. I saw no more of the leopard that night, and at sunrise I collected my men and set off down the steep hill to Rudraprayag. whilst the husband and his friends carried away the woman's remains for cremation. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Preparations. My thoughts, as cold and stiff I walked down the hill to Rudraprayag from the scene of my night's failure, were very bitter, for from whatever angle it was viewed, there was no question that the fickle jade chance had played both Garhwal and myself a scurvy trick which we did not deserve. However little I merited, the people of our hills credit me with supernatural powers where man-eaters are concerned. News that I was on my way to try to rid Garhwal of the man-eater had preceded me, and while I was still many days' march from Rudraprayag, the men I met on the roads and those who from their fields or village homes saw me passing greeted me with a faith in the accomplishment of my mission that was as touching as it was embarrassing, and which increased in intensity the nearer I approached my destination. Had anybody been there to witness my entry into Rudraprayag, he would have found it hard to believe that the man whom the populace thronged round was no hero returning from the wars, but a man very sensible of his limitations, who greatly feared that the task he had undertaken was beyond his powers of accomplishment. 500 square miles, much of which was clothed with dense scrub jungle, and all of which was rugged and mountainous, was an enormous area in which to find and shoot one particular leopard out of possibly 50 that inhabited it. And the more I saw of the grand and beautiful country, the less I liked it from the viewpoint of the task I had undertaken. The populace quite naturally did not share my misgivings. To them I was one who had rid others of man-eaters, and who had now come among them to rid them of the menace they had lived under for 8 long years. And then, with incredible good luck, I had within a few hours of my arrival got the animal I was in pursuit of to kill one of my goats, and by staying out a little after dark to follow me to that side of the Alaknanda, where I believed it would be less difficult to deal with it than it would have been on the other side. Following on this initial success had been the kill of the unfortunate woman. I had tried to prevent the further loss of human life, and had failed, and my failure had presented me with an opportunity of shooting the leopard which otherwise might not have presented for many months. As I had been toiling uphill behind my guide the previous day, I had weighed up my chances of killing the leopard and assessed them at 2 to 1, despite the facts that the animal had in recent years earned the reputation of never returning to a kill, that it was a dark night, and that I had no aid to night shooting. The day I visited Michael Keene and told him I would go to Garhwal, he had asked me if I had everything I wanted, and hearing that I had only lacked a night shooting light and would telegraph to Calcutta for one, he said the least the government could do for me was to provide me with a light, and he promised to have the best one procurable waiting for me at Rudraprayag. Though my disappointment was great when I found that the light had not arrived, it was mitigated by my ability to see in the dark, the ability on which I had assessed my chances at 2 to 1. So much depended on the success of that night's venture that I had armed myself with a spare rifle and shotgun, and when from my concealed position on the hayrick I viewed the scene, the short range at which I should get my shot, and the perfectly camouflaged gun trap into which the leopard would of a certainty run if I missed or wounded him, my hopes rose high, and I put my chances of success at 10 to 1. Then had come the storm, with visibility reduced to practically nil, and without the electric light I had failed, and my failure would in a few hours be known throughout the stricken area. Exercise, warm water, and food have a wonderfully soothing effect on bitter thoughts, and by the time I had picked my way down the steep hillside, had a hot bath and breakfast, I had ceased to rail at fate and was able to take a more reasonable view of my night's failure. Regret over a bullet fired into the ground was as profitless as regret over milk spilt on sand, and provided the leopard had not crossed the Alaknanda, my chances of killing it had improved, for I now had the electric shooting light, which the runner had braved both the leopard and the storm to bring me. The first thing to do was to find out if the leopard had crossed the Alaknanda, And as I was firm in my conviction that the only way it could do this was by way of the suspension bridges, I set out after breakfast to glean some information about this. I discounted the possibility of the leopard having crossed the Chatwa People's Bridge, for no matter how great the shock he had received by the discharge of my heavy rifle a few feet from his head, it was not possible that he would have covered the 14 miles that separated the kill from the bridge in the few hours that remained between the firing of my shot and daylight, so I decided to confine my search to the Rudraprayag bridge. There were 3 approaches to the bridge, one from the north, one from the south, and between these 2 a well-beaten footpath from the Rudraprayag bazaar. After examining these approaches very carefully, I crossed the bridge and examined the Kedarnath pilgrim road for half a mile, and then the footpath on which 3 nights previously my goat had been killed. Satisfied that the leopard had not crossed the river, I determined to put in operation my plan for closing the 2 bridges at night and thus confining the leopard to my side of the river. The plan was a simple one, and given the cooperation of the caretakers of the bridges, both of whom lived on the left bank and close to the bridge abutments, was certain of success. To close the only means of communication between the 2 banks of the river over a stretch of some 30 miles would appear to be a very high-handed proceeding, but actually it was not, for no human being dared to use the bridge between sunset and sunrise owing to the curfew imposed by the leopard. The bridges were closed by wedging thorn bushes in the 4-foot-wide archway in the towers carrying the steel cables from which the plank footway was suspended, and during the whole period that the bridges were closed with thorn or were guarded by me, no human being demanded passage across them. I spent in all some 20 nights on the tower on the left bank of the Rudraprayag bridge, and those nights will never be forgotten. The tower was built out on a projecting rock and was 20 feet high, and the platform on the top of it, which had been worn smooth by the wind, was about 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. There were 2 means of reaching this platform, one by swarming along the cables which ran through holes near the top of the tower and were anchored in the hillside some 50 feet from the tower, and the other by climbing up a very rickety bamboo ladder. I chose the latter way, for the cables were coated over with some black and very evil-smelling matter which clung to one's hands and permanently stained one's clothes. The ladder, 2 uneven lengths of bamboo connected with thin sticks loosely held in position with string, only reached to within 4 feet of the platform. Standing on the top rung of the ladder and dependent for a handhold on the friction of the palms of my hands on the smooth masonry, the safe gaining of the platform was an acrobatic feat that had less appeal the more it was tried. All the rivers in this part of the Himalayas flow from north to south, and in the valleys through which they flow blows a wind which changes directions with the rising and the setting of the sun. During daylight hours, the wind, locally called dadu, blows from the south, and during the hours of night it blows from the north. At the time when I used to take up my position on the platform, there was usually a lull in the wind, but shortly thereafter it started blowing as a light zephyr, gaining in strength as daylight faded and amounting by midnight to a raging gale. There was no handhold on the platform, and even when lying flat on my stomach, to increase friction and reduce wind pressure, there was imminent danger of being blown off onto the rocks 60 feet below, off which one would have bounced into the icy cold waters of Alaknanda. Not that the temperature of the water would have been of any interest after a fall of 60 feet onto sharp and jagged rocks. Strangely enough, whenever I felt in fear of falling, it was always the water and never the rocks that I thought of. Added to the discomfort of the wind, I suffered torment from a multitude of small ants which entered my clothes and ate away patches of skin. During the 20 nights I guarded the bridge, the thorn bushes were not placed in position, and in all that long period the bridge was only crossed by one living thing, a jackal. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Magic. Each evening when I went to the bridge, I was accompanied by 2 men who carried the ladder that enabled me to climb to the platform, and which they removed after handing me my rifle. On the second day, as we arrived at the bridge, we saw a man dressed in flowing white robes, with something glinting on his head and breast. He carried a 6-foot silver cross, and was approaching the bridge from the direction of Kedarnath. On reaching the bridge, the man knelt down, and holding the cross in front of him, bowed his head. After remaining in this position for a little while, he raised the cross high, rose to his feet, took a few steps forward, and again knelt down and bowed his head. This he continued to do at short intervals all the way across the long bridge. As he passed me, the man raised his hand in salutation, but since he appeared to be deep in prayer, I did not speak to him. The glints I had seen on his headdress and breast were, I perceived, silver crosses. My men had been as interested in this strange apparition as I had been, and watching him climb the steep footpath to the Rudraprayag bazaar, they asked me what manner of man he was, and from what country he had come. That he was a Christian was apparent, and as I had not heard him speak, I assumed from his long hair, jet-black luxuriant beard, and what I could see of his features, that he was a man from northern India. The following morning, when with the help of the ladder I had climbed down from the tower and was proceeding to the inspection bungalow, where I passed that portion of the daylight hours that I did not spend in visiting near and distant villages in search of news of the man-eater, I saw the tall white-robed figure standing on a great slab of rock near the road, surveying the river. At my approach he left the rock and greeted me, and when I asked him what had brought him to these parts, he said he had come from a distant land to free the people of Garhwal from the evil spirit that was tormenting them. When I asked him how he proposed accomplishing this feat, he said he would make an effigy of a tiger, and after he had, by prayer, induced the evil spirit to enter it, he would set the effigy afloat on the Ganges, and the river would convey it down to the sea, from where it could not return, and where it would do no further harm to human beings. However much I doubted the man's ability to accomplish the task he had set himself, I could not help admiring his faith and his industry. He arrived each morning before I left the tower, and I found him still at work when I returned in the evening, laboring with split bamboos, string, paper, and cheap-colored cloth on his tiger. When the effigy was nearing completion, a heavy rainstorm one night made the whole structure come unstuck, but undaunted, he cheerfully started on it again next morning, singing as he worked. Came at last the great day when the tiger, about the size of a horse and resembling no known animal, was fashioned to his satisfaction. Who is there among our hill folk who does not wholeheartedly enjoy taking part in a tamasha? When the effigy, tied to a long pole, was carried down to a steep path to a small sandy beach, it had an escort of over 100 men, many of whom were beating gongs and blowing long trumpets. At the river's edge the effigy was unlashed from the pole. The white-robed man, with his silver crosses on headgear and breast, and his 6-foot cross in his hands, knelt on the sand, and with earnest prayer induced the evil spirit to enter his handiwork, and then the effigy, with the crash of gongs and blare of trumpets, was consigned to the Ganges, and speeding on its way to the sea by a liberal offerings of sweets and flowers. Next morning the familiar figure was absent from the rock, and when I asked some men who were on their way to have an early dip in the river where my friend of the flowing robes had come from, and where he had gone, they answered, "Who can tell whence a holy man has come, and who dare question whither he has departed?" These men, with sandalwood paste caste marks on their foreheads, who spoke of the man as holy, and all those others who had taken part in the launching ceremony, were Hindus. In India, where there are no passports or identity discs, and where religion counts for so much, except among those who have crossed the black water, I believe that a man wearing a saffron robe, or carrying a beggar's bowl, or with silver crosses on his headgear and chest, could walk from the Khyber Pass to Cape Comorin without once being questioned about his destination or the object of his journey. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. A Near Escape. While I was still guarding the bridge, Ibbotson and his wife Jean arrived from Pori. and as the accommodation in the inspection bungalow were very limited, I moved out to make room for them and set up my 40-pound tent on the hill on the far side of the Pilgrim Road. A tent afforded little protection against an animal that had left his claw marks on every door and window for miles around, so I helped my men to put a thorn fence around the ground we intended to camp on. Overhanging this plot of ground was a giant prickly pear tree, and as its branches interfered with the erection of the tent, I told the men to cut it down. When the tree had been partly cut through, I changed my mind, for I saw that I should be without shade during the heat of the day, so instead of felling the tree, I told the men to lop the overhanging branches. This tree, which was leaning over the camp at an angle of 45 degrees, was on the far side of the fence. There were 8 of us in the little camp, and when we had eaten our evening meal, I wedged a thorn bush securely into the opening in the fence we had entered by, and as I did so, I noticed that it would be very easy for the man-eater to climb the tree and drop down on our side of the fence. However, it was too late then to do anything about it, and if the leopard left us alone for that one night, the tree could be cut down and removed in the morning. I had no tents for my men, and had intended that they should sleep with Ibbotson's men in the outbuildings of the inspection bungalow, but this they refused to do, asserting that there was no more danger for them than there was for me in the open tent. My cook, who was, as I discovered, a very noisy sleeper, was lying next to and about a yard from me, and beyond him, packed like sardines in the little enclosure, were the 6 Garhwalis I had brought from Nainital. The weak spot in our defense was the tree, and I went to sleep thinking of it. It was a brilliant moonlit night, and round about midnight I was suddenly awakened by hearing the leopard climbing the tree. Picking up the rifle, which was lying ready loaded on the bed, I swung my legs off the bed and had just slipped my feet into my slippers to avoid the thorns which were scattered all around, when there was an ominous crack from the partly cut through tree, followed by a yell from the cook of "Bag! Bag!" In one jump I was outside the tent, and swinging around was just too late to get the rifle to bear on the leopard as it sprang up the bank onto a terraced field. Pulling the bush out of the gap, I dashed up to the field, which was about 40 yards in width and bare of crops, and as I stood scanning the hillside dotted over with thorn bushes and a few big rocks, the alarm call of a jackal far up the hill informed me that the leopard had gone beyond my reach. The cook informed me later that he had been lying on his back, a fact of which I had been long aware, and hearing the tree crack he had opened his eyes and looked straight into the leopard's face just as it was preparing to jump down. The tree was cut down the very next day, and the fence strengthened, and though we stayed in that camp for several weeks, our slumbers were not again disturbed. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. The Gin Trap. From reports received from nearby villages, where unsuccessful attempts had been made to break into houses, and from the pug marks I had seen on the roads, I knew that the man-eater was still in the vicinity, and a few days after the arrival of the Ibbotsons, news was brought that a cow had been killed in a village 2 miles from Rudraprayag, and about half a mile from the village where I had sat on the hayrick in a walnut tree. Arrived at the village, we found that a leopard had broken down the door of a one-roomed house, and had killed and dragged to the door one of the several cows that were in it, and not being able to drag it through the door, had left it on the threshold after eating a good meal. The house was in the heart of the village, and on prospecting around, we found that by making a hole in the wall of a house a few yards away, we could overlook the kill. The owner of this house, who was also the owner of the dead cow, was only too willing to fall in with our plans, and as evening closed in, we locked ourselves very securely into the room, and after eating our sandwiches and drinking the tea we had brought with us, we mounted guard in turns over the hole in the wall throughout the long night without either seeing or hearing anything of the leopard. When we emerged in the morning, the villagers took us round the village, which was of considerable size, and showed us the claw marks on doors and windows made by the man-eater in the course of years in his attempts to get at the inmates. One door in particular had more and deeper claw marks than any other. It was the door the leopard had forced to enter the room in which the 40 goats and the boy had been secured. A day or two later, another cow was reported to have been killed in a small village on the hill a few hundred yards from the bungalow. Here again we found that the cow had been killed inside a house, dragged as far as the door, and partly eaten. Facing the door and distant from it about 10 yards was a newly built hayrick, 16 feet tall and built on a wooden platform 2 feet above ground. News of the kill was brought to us early in the morning, so we had the whole day before us, and the machan we built by evening was, I am sure, not only the most effective, but also the most artistic that has ever been constructed for a similar purpose. To start with, the rick was dismantled, and a scaffolding of poles was set around the platform. With these poles to support it, a second and smaller platform was built 4 feet above the lower one. 2-inch mesh wire netting was then wound round the whole structure, leaving only the space bare between the lower platform and the ground. Wisps of straw were then looped into the meshes of the netting, and a little straw was spread round the rick and under the platform, just as it had been before we started work. One of the joint owners of the hayrick, who had been absent from the village for a day or two, and who returned just as we had finished our task, would not believe that the rick had been disturbed until he felt it all around and had been shown the second rick we had built with the spare hay in an adjoining field. As the sun was setting, we crawled through the hole we had left in the netting and entered the machan, securely closing the entrance behind us. Ibbotson is a little shorter than me, so he took the upper platform, and when we had made ourselves comfortable, we each made a small hole in the straw to shoot through. As it would not be possible for us to communicate with each other once the leopard arrived, we agreed that whoever saw it first was to fire. It was a bright moonlit night, so there was no need for either of us to use the electric light. Sounds in the village quietened down after the evening meal had been eaten, and at about 10 p.m. I heard the leopard coming down the hill behind us. On arriving at the rick, it paused for a few minutes and then started to crawl under the platform I was sitting on. Immediately below me, and with only the thickness of a plank between my seat and his head, he paused for a long minute and then started to crawl forward. And just as I was expecting him to emerge from under the platform and give me an easy shot at a range of about 3 or 4 feet, there was a loud creak in the platform above me. The leopard dashed out to the right, where I could not see him, and went up the hill. The creaking of the planks at the critical moment had resulted from Ibbotson changing his position to relieve a very painful cramp in both legs. After the fright he got, the leopard abandoned the kill and did not return that night or the next night. 2 nights later, another cow was killed a few hundred yards above the Rudraprayag bazaar. The owner of this cow lived alone in an isolated house, which contained only one room, a room which was divided by a rough partition made of odd bits of plank into a kitchen and living room. Sometime during the night, a noise in the kitchen, the door of which he had forgotten to shut, awakened the man, and a little later in the dim moonlight, which the open door was admitting, he saw the leopard through the wide chinks in the partition, trying to tear one of the planks out. For a long time, the man lay and sweated, while the leopard tried plank after plank. Eventually, being unable to find a weak place in the partition, the leopard left the kitchen and killed the man's cow, which was tethered in a grass lean-to against the side of the house. After killing the cow, the leopard broke the rope by which it was tethered, dragged it to a short distance from the lean-to, and left it out in the open after partaking of a good meal. On the very edge of the hill, and about 20 yards from where the dead cow was lying, there was a fair-sized tree, in the upper branches of which a hayrick had been built. On this natural machan, from which there was a sheer drop of several hundred feet into the valley below, Ibbotson and I decided to sit. To assist in the killing of the man-eater, the government a few days previously had sent us a gin trap. This trap, which was 5 feet long and weighed 80 pounds, was the most fearsome thing of its kind I have ever seen. Its jaws, armed with sharp teeth 3 inches long, had a spread of 24 inches and were actuated by two powerful springs which needed 2 men to compress. When leaving the kill, the leopard had followed a footpath across a field about 40 yards wide, up a 3-foot bank, and across another field bordered by a densely scrub covered hill. At this 3-foot step from the upper to the lower field, we set the trap, and to ensure the leopard stepping onto it, we planted a few thorn twigs on either side of the path. To one of the traps was attached a short length of half-inch thick chain, terminating in a ring 3 inches in diameter. Through this ring we drove a stout peg, chaining the trap to the ground. When these arrangements had been completed, Jean Ibbotson returned to the bungalow with our men, and Ibbotson and I climbed up to the hayrick. After tying a stick in front of us and looping a little hay over it to act as a screen, we made ourselves comfortable and waited for the leopard, which we felt sure would not escape us on this occasion. As evening closed in, heavy clouds spread over the sky, and as the moon was not due to rise until 9 p.m., we had of necessity to depend on the electric light for the accuracy of our shooting until then. This light was a heavy and cumbersome affair, and as Ibbotson insisted on my taking the shot, I attached it to my rifle with some little difficulty. An hour after dark, a succession of angry roars apprised us of the fact that the leopard was in the trap. Switching on the electric light, I saw the leopard rearing up, with the trap dangling from his forelegs, and taking a hurried shot, my .450 bullet struck a link in the chain and severed it. Freed from the peg, the leopard went along the field in a series of great leaps, carrying the trap in front of him, followed up by the bullet from my left barrel and 2 lethal bullets from Ibbotson's shotgun, all of which missed him. In trying to reload my rifle, I displaced some part of the light, after which it refused to function. Hearing the roars of the leopard and our 4 shots, the people in Rudraprayag Bazaar and in nearby villages swarmed out of their houses, carrying lanterns and pine torches, and converged from all sides on the isolated house. Shouting to them to keep clear was of no avail, for they were making so much noise that they could not hear us. So while I climbed down the tree, taking my rifle with me, a hazardous proceeding in the dark, Ibbotson lit and pumped up the petrol lamp we had taken into the machan with us. Letting the lamp down to me on the end of a length of rope, Ibbotson joined me on the ground, and together we were in the direction the leopard had taken. Halfway along the field, there was a hump caused by an outcrop of rock. This hump we approached with Ibbotson holding the heavy lamp high above his head, while I walked by his side with rifle to shoulder. Beyond the hump was a little depression in the ground, and crouching down in this depression and facing us and growling was the leopard. Within a few minutes of my bullet crashing into his head, we were surrounded by an excited crowd who literally danced with joy round their long-dreaded enemy. The animal that lay dead before me was an outsized male leopard, who the previous night had tried to tear down a partition to get at a human being, and who had been shot in an area in which dozens of human beings had been killed. All good and sufficient reasons for assuming that he was the man-eater. But I could not make myself believe that he was the same animal I had seen the night I sat over the body of the woman. True, it had been a dark night and I had only vaguely seen the outline of the leopard. Even so, I was convinced that the animal that was now being lashed to a pole by willing hands was not the man-eater. With the Ibbotsons leading the way, followed by the men carrying the leopard and a crowd of several hundred men, we set off via the bazaar for the bungalow. As I stumbled down the hill in the wake of the procession, the only one in all that throng who did not believe that the man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag was dead, my thoughts went back to an occurrence that had taken place not far from our winter home when I was a small boy, and which I saw recounted many years later in a book called Brave Deeds, or perhaps it was Bravest Deeds. The occurrence concerned 2 men, Smeaton of the Indian Civil Service and Braidwood of the Forest Department. One dark stormy night, in pre-railway days, these 2 men were traveling in a dak gadi from Moradabad to Kaladhungi, and on going round a bend in the road, they ran into a rogue elephant. In killing the driver and the two horses, the elephant overturned the gari. Braidwood had a rifle, and while he got it out of its case, put it together, and loaded it, Smeaton climbed onto the gari and released the one unbroken lamp from its socket. Then Smeaton, holding the oil lamp, which only gave a glimmer of light over his head, advanced up to the elephant and shone the light on his forehead to enable Braidwood to get in a killing shot. Admittedly, there was a great difference between a rogue elephant and a leopard. Even so, there are few who would care to walk up to a pain-maddened leopard, which we later found had practically torn its paw free and was only held by a thin strip of skin, holding a lamp above his head and depending for safety on a companion's bullet. For the first night in many years, every house in the bazaar was open, with women and children standing in the doorways. Progress was slow. For every few yards, the leopard was put down to let the children cluster around and get a better view of it. At the farther end of the long street, our escort left us, and the leopard was carried in triumph to the bungalow by our men. Returning to the bungalow, after a wash at my camp, the Ibbotsons and I, both during and long after it, put forward our arguments for and against the dead leopard being the man-eater. Eventually, without either side convincing the other, we decided that as Ibbotson had to get back to his work at Pauri, and I was tired out after my long stay at Rudraprayag, we would spend the next day in skinning the leopard and drying the skin, and on the day after would break camp and make for Pauri. From early morning to late evening, relays of men kept coming in from near and distant villages to see the leopard, and as most of these men asserted that they recognized the animal as the man-eater, the conviction of the Ibbotsons that they were right and I was wrong grew. 2 concessions at my request Ibbotson made. He added his warning to the people to mind and not to relax precautions against the man-eater, and he refrained from telegraphing to tell the government that we had shot the man-eater. We went early to bed that night, for we were to start at daybreak next morning. I was up while it was still dark and was having chota hazri when I heard voices on the road. As this was very unusual, I called out to ask what men were doing on the road at that hour. On seeing me, 4 men climbed up the path to my camp and informed me that they had been sent by the Patwari to tell me that a woman had just been killed by the man-eater on the far side of the river about a mile from the Chhatwa People Bridge. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13. The Hunters Hunted. Ibbotson was just unbolting the door to admit his man with early tea when I arrived, and after he had countermanded his move to Pauri, we sat on Jean's bed with a large-scale map between us, drinking tea and discussing our plans. Ibbotson's work at his headquarters at Pauri was pressing, and at most he could only spare 2 more days and nights. I had telegraphed to Nainital the previous day to say I was returning home via Pauri and Kotdwara. This telegram I decided to cancel, and instead of going by rail, I would return on foot the way I had come. These details settled, and the village where the woman had been killed found on the map, I returned to camp to tell my men of our change of plans and to instruct them to pack up and follow us, accompanied by the 4 men who had brought news of the kill. Jeans was to remain at Rudraprayag, so after breakfast Ibbotson and I set off on 2 of his horses, a Gulf Arab and an English mare, 2 of the most sure-footed animals I have ever had the good fortune to ride. We took our rifles, a blue flame stove, a petrol lamp, and some provisions with us, and were accompanied by one of Ibbotson's syces on a borrowed horse carrying food for our horses. We left the horses at the Chhatwa People Bridge. This bridge had not been closed the night we shot the leopard, with the result that the man-eater had got across the river and secured a kill at the first village he visited. A guide was waiting for us at the bridge, and he took us up a very steep ridge and along a grassy hillside, and then down a deep and densely wooded ravine with a very small stream flowing through it. Here we found the Patwari and some 20 men guarding the kill. The kill was a very robust and fair girl, some 18 or 20 years of age. She was lying on her face with her hands by her sides. Every vestige of clothing had been stripped from her, and she had been licked by the leopard from the soles of her feet to her neck, in which there were 4 great teeth marks. Only a few pounds of flesh had been eaten from the upper portion of her body, and a few pounds from the lower portion. The drums we had heard as we came up the hill were being beaten by the men who were guarding the kill, and as it was then about 2 p.m., and there was no chance of the leopard being anywhere in the vicinity, we went up the village to brew ourselves some tea, taking the patwari and the guard with us. After tea, we went and had a look at the house where the girl had been killed. It was a stone-built house, consisting of 1 room, situated in the middle of a terraced field some 2 or 3 acres in extent, and it was occupied by the girl, her husband, and their 6-month-old child. 2 days previous to the kill, the husband had gone to Pauri to give evidence in a land dispute case and had left his father in charge of the house. On the night of the kill, after the girl and her father-in-law had partaken of their evening meal, and it was getting near time to retire for the night, the girl, who had been nursing her child, handed it over to her father-in-law, unlatched the door, and stepped outside to squat down. I have already mentioned that there are no sanitary conveniences in the houses of our hill folk. When the child was transferred from the mother to the grandfather, it started crying, so even if there had been any sound from outside, and I am sure there was none, he would not have heard it. It was a dark night. After waiting for a few minutes, the man called to the girl, and receiving no answer, he called again. Then he got up and hurriedly closed and latched the door. Rain had fallen earlier in the evening, and it was easy to reconstruct the scene. Shortly after the rain had stopped, the leopard, coming from the direction of the village, had crouched down behind a rock in the field about 30 yards to the left front of the door. Here it had lain for some time, possibly listening to the man and the girl talking. When the girl opened the door, she squatted down on its right-hand side, partly turning her back on the leopard, who had crept round the far side of the rock, covered the 20 yards separating him from the corner of the house with belly to the ground, and creeping along close to the wall of the house, had caught the girl from behind and dragged her to the rock. Here, when the girl was dead, or possibly when the man called out in alarm, the leopard had picked her up and, holding her high so that no mark of hand or foot showed on the soft newly ploughed ground, had carried her across one field, down a 3-foot bank, and across another field, which ended in a 12-foot drop onto a well-used footpath. Down this drop the leopard had sprung with the girl, who weighed about 11 stone, in his mouth, and some idea of his strength will be realized from the fact that when he landed on the footpath, he did not let any portion of her body come in contact with the ground. Crossing the footpath, he had gone straight down the hill for half a mile to the spot where he had undressed the girl. After eating a little of her, he had left her lying in a little glade of emerald green grass under the shade of a tree roofed over with dense creepers. At about 4 o'clock, we went down to sit over the kill, taking the petrol lamp and night shooting light with us. It was reasonable to assume that the leopard had heard the noise the villagers made when searching for the girl, and later when guarding the body, and that if it returned to the kill, it would do so with great caution. So we decided not to sit near the kill and selected a tree about 60 yards away on the hill overlooking the glade. This tree, a stunted oak, was growing out of the hill at almost a right angle, and after we had hidden the petrol lamp in a little hollow and covered it over with pine needles, Ibbotson took his seat in a fork of the tree from where he had a clear view of the kill, while I sat on the trunk with my back to him and facing the hill. Ibbotson was to take the shot, while I saw to our safety. As the shooting light was not functioning, possibly because the battery had faded out, our plan was to sit up as long as Ibbotson could see to shoot, and then, with the help of the petrol lamp, get back to the village, where we hoped to find that our men had arrived from Rudraprayag. We had not had time to prospect the ground, but the villagers had informed us that there was heavy jungle to the east of the kill, to which they felt sure the leopard had retired when they drove it off. If the leopard came from this direction, Ibbotson would see it long before it got to the glade, and would get an easy shot, for his rifle was fitted with a telescopic sight, which not only made for accurate shooting, but which also gave us an extra half hour, as we had found from tests. When a minute of daylight more or less may make the difference between success and failure, this modification of the light factor is very important. The sun was setting behind the high hills to the west, and we had been in shadow for some minutes when a cocker dashed down the hill, barking from the direction in which we had been told there was heavy jungle. On the shoulder of the hill the animal pulled up, and after barking in one spot for some time went away on the far side, and the sound dies away in the distance. The cocker had undoubtedly been alarmed by a leopard, and though it was quite possible that there were other leopards in that area, my hopes had been raised, and when I looked round at Ibbotson I saw too that he was keyed up, and that he had both hands on his rifle. Light was beginning to fade, but was still good enough to shoot by even without the aid of the telescopic sight, when a pine cone dislodged from behind some low bushes 30 yards above us came rolling down the hill and struck the tree close to my feet. The leopard had arrived, and possibly, suspecting danger, had taken a line that would enable him to prospect from a safe place on the hill all the ground in the vicinity of his kill. Unfortunately, in doing so, he had got our tree in a direct line with the kill, and though I, who was shooting no outline, might escape observation, he would be certain to see Ibbotson, who was sitting in a fork of the tree. When sufficient light for me to shoot by had long since gone, and Ibbotson's telescopic sight was no longer of any use to him, we heard the leopard coming stealthily down towards the tree. It was then time to take action, so I asked Ibbotson to take my place while I retrieved the lamp. This lamp was of German make and was called a Petromax. It gave a brilliant light, but with its long body and longer handle was not designed to be used as a lantern in a jungle. I am a little taller than Ibbotson, and suggested that I should carry the lamp, but Ibbotson said he could manage all right, and moreover that he would rather depend on my rifle than his own. So we set off, Ibbotson leading, and I following with both hands on my rifle. 50 yards from the tree, while climbing over a rock, Ibbotson slipped. The base of the lamp came in violent contact with the rock, and the mantle fell in dust to the bottom of the lamp. The streak of blue flame, directed from the nozzle onto the petrol reservoir, gave sufficient light for us to see where to put our feet, but the question was how long we should have even this much light. Ibbotson was of the opinion that he could carry the lamp for 3 minutes before it burst. 3 minutes, in which to do a stiff climb of half a mile, over ground on which it was necessary to change direction every few steps to avoid huge rocks and thorn bushes, and possibly followed, and actually followed as we found later, by a man-eater, was a terrifying prospect. There are events in one's life which, no matter how remote, never fade from memory. The climb up that hill in the dark was one for me. When we eventually reached the footpath, our troubles were not ended, for the path was a series of buffalo wallows, and we did not know where our men were. Alternately slipping on wet ground and stumbling over unseen rocks, we at last came to some stone steps, which took off from the path and went up to the right. Climbing these steps, we found a small courtyard, on the far side of which was a door. We had heard the gurgling of a hookah as we came up the steps, so I kicked the door and shouted to the inmates to open. As no answer came, I took out a box of matches and shook it, crying that if the door was not opened in a minute, I would set the thatch alight. On this, an agitated voice came from inside the house, begging me not to set the house on fire, and saying that the door was being opened. A minute later, first the inner door, and then the outer door was being opened, and in 2 strides Ibbotson and I were in the house, slamming the inner door and putting our backs to it. There were some 12 or 14 men, women, and children of all ages in the room. When the men had regained their wits after the unceremonious entry, they begged us to forgive them for not having opened the doors sooner, adding that they and their families had lived so long in terror of the man-eater that their courage had gone. Not knowing what form the man-eater might take, they suspected every sound they heard at night. In their fear they had our full sympathy, for from the time Ibbotson had slipped and broken the mantle, and a few minutes later had extinguished the red-hot lamp to prevent it from bursting, I had been convinced that one, and possibly even both, of us would not live to reach the village. We were told that our men had arrived about sundown and that they had been housed in a block of buildings farther along the hill. The two able-bodied men in the room offered to show us the way, but as we knew it would be murder to let them return to their homes alone, we declined their offer, which had been made with the full realization of the risk it would entail, and asked if they could provide us with a light of some kind. After rummaging about in a corner of the room, an old and decrepit lantern with a cracked globe was produced, and when vigorous shaking had revealed that it contained a few drops of oil, it was lit, and with the combined good wishes of the inmates we left the house, the two doors being shut and bolted on our heels. More buffalo wallows and more sunken rocks, but with the glimmer of light to help us as we made good progress, and finding the second lot of steps we had been instructed to climb, we mounted them and found ourselves in a long courtyard facing a row of double-storied buildings extending to the right and to the left, every door of which was fast shut, and not a glimmer of light showing anywhere. When we called, a door was opened, and by climbing a short flight of stone steps we gained the veranda of the upper story, and found the two adjoining rooms which had been placed at the disposal of our men and ourselves. While the men were relieving us of the lamp and our rifles, a dog arrived from nowhere. He was just a friendly village pie, and after sniffing around our legs and wagging his tail, he went towards the steps up we had just come. The next second, with a scream of fear followed by hysterical barking, he backed towards us with all of his hair on his end. The lantern we had been lent had died on us as we reached the courtyard, but our men had procured its twin brother. Though Ibbotson held it at all angles while I hurriedly reloaded my rifle, he could not get its light to illuminate the ground 8 feet below. By watching the dog, it was possible to follow the movements of the leopard. When the leopard had crossed the yard and gone down the steps leading to the footpath, the dog gradually stopped barking and lay down intently watching in that direction and growling at intervals. The room that had been vacated for us had no windows, and as the only way in which we could have occupied it in safety would have been by closing the solid door and excluding all air and light, we decided to spend the night on the veranda. The dog evidently belonged to the late occupant of the room, and had been accustomed to sleeping there, for he lay contentedly at our feet and gave us a feeling of safety as we watched in turn through the long hours of the night. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. Retreat. At daybreak next morning, we very carefully stalked the kill, and were disappointed to find that the leopard had not returned to it, which we felt sure he would do after his failure to bag one of us the previous evening. During the day, while Ibbotson dealt with some office work that had been sent out to him, I took a rifle and went off to see if I could get a shot at the leopard. Tracking on the hard and pine-needle covered ground was not possible, so I made for the shoulder of the hill, beyond which the villagers had told us there was heavy jungle. Here I found the ground very difficult to negotiate, for in addition to dense scrub jungle through which it was not possible to penetrate, there was a series of rock cliffs on which it was impossible for a human being to find foothold. In this area there was a surprisingly large head of game, and on the paths that intersected it I found the tracks of kakar, ghurul, pig, and a solitary sarau. Of the leopard, except for a few old scratch marks, I found no trace at all. The gin trap that had been sent off from Rudraprayag the previous day arrived while we were having lunch, and in the early evening we took it down to the glade and after setting it, poisoned the kill with cyanide. I had no experience of poisons, nor had Ibbotson, but in a conversation with a doctor friend before leaving Nainital, I had mentioned that government wanted me to try every means to kill the man-eater, and that there was little use in my trying poison, as the records showed that the leopard throve on it. I told him what poisons had hitherto been tried, and he then recommended my using cyanide, which was the best poison for the cat family. I had passed this information on to Ibbotson, and a few days previously a supply had arrived with capsules with which to use it. We inserted a few of these capsules in the kill at the places where the leopard had eaten. There was every hope of the leopard returning to the kill this second night, and as he had seen us on the tree the previous evening, we decided not to sit up, but to leave him to the gin trap and to the poison. In a big pine tree near the footpath we built a machan, which we padded with hay and on which we took up our position after we had eaten the dinner which Ibbotson cooked on the blue flame stove. Here on the comfortable machan we were able to lie at full stretch and talk and smoke, for our only reason for being there was to listen for sounds from the direction of the kill. We watched and slept by turns, hoping to hear the angry roar of the leopard if by accident it walked into the trap, for here there was no well-used track along which to direct the leopard to it. Once during the night a kakad barked, and in the opposite direction to that from which we expected the leopard to come. At the first streak of dawn we climbed out of the tree, and after brewing ourselves a cup of tea, visited the kill, which we found lying just as we had left it. Ibbotson left for Rudraprayag after an early breakfast, and I was packing my things and having a final word with the villagers before starting on my 15-day journey back to Nainital, when a party of men arrived to give the news that a cow had just been killed by a leopard in a village 4 miles away. They suspected that the cow had been killed by the man-eater, for the previous night, the night the leopard had followed Ibbotson and myself from the tree to the veranda, and towards the small hours of the morning, the leopard had made a determined attempt to break down the door of the headman's house. Late the following evening, the cow had been killed in the jungle 300 yards from his house. At the urgent request of these men, I postponed my departure to Nainital and accompanied them back to their village, taking the gin trap and a supply of poison with me. The headman's house was on a little knoll surrounded by cultivated land, and was approached by a footpath which for a short distance ran over soft and boggy ground. Here I found the pug marks of the man-eater. The headman had seen me approaching across the valley, and had a steaming dish of tea brewed in fresh milk and sweetened with jaggery waiting for me. While I drank this rich and over-sweetened liquid on the courtyard, sitting on a reed couch upholstered with ghurul skins, he drew my attention to the condition of the door which 2 nights previously the leopard had attempted to break down, in which attempt it would undoubtedly have succeeded if he had not fortunately had some sawn timber in the house intended for repairing the roof, which he had used to shore up the door from inside. The headman was old and crippled with rheumatism, so he sent his son to show me the kill while he made room in the house for myself and my men. I found the kill, a young cow in grand condition, lying on a flat bit of ground just above the cattle track in an ideal position for setting up the gin trap. Its back was against a tangle of wild rose bushes, and its hooves were against a foot-high bank. While eating, the leopard had sat on the bank with its 4 paws between the cow's legs. Having dug away the ground between the cow's legs and removed it to a distance, I set the trap where the leopard had placed his paws and covered it over with big green leaves. Then, after sprinkling on a layer of earth, I replaced the deal leaves, bits of dry sticks, and splinters of bone in the exact position between the cow's legs in which I had found them. Not one of 100 human beings going to the kill would have noticed that the ground had in any way been disturbed and a deadly trap set. My arrangements made to my satisfaction, I retraced my steps and climbed a tree halfway between the kill and the headman's house, where I would be handy if needed at the trap. Near sundown, a pair of colleague pheasants and their brood of 5 chicks, which I had been watching for some time, suddenly took alarm and went scuttling down the hill, and a few seconds later a cocker came dashing towards me, and after barking under my tree for a little while, went off up the hill on tiptoe. Nothing happened after that, and when it was getting too dark under the shade of the trees for me to see the sights of my rifle, I slipped off the tree and myself tiptoed away on rubber-shod feet towards the village. 100 yards from the headman's house, the track ran across an open glade, some 30 yards long and 20 yards wide. On the upper hillside of the glade was a big rock. As I reached this open ground, I felt I was being followed, and determined to exploit the situation, I left the track and, taking 2 long steps over soft and spongy ground, lay down behind the rock with only one eye showing in the direction of the kill. For 10 minutes I lay on the wet ground. When daylight had all but gone, I regained the path and, taking every precaution, covered the remaining distance to the headman's house. Once during the night, the headman roused me from a sound sleep to tell me he had heard the leopard scratching on the door, and when I opened the door next morning I saw the pug marks of the man-eater in the dust in front of it. These pug marks I followed back to the glade and found that the leopard had done just what I had done the previous evening. He had left the track where I had crossed the soft ground to the rock, and after regaining the track had followed me to the house, round which he had walked several times. On leaving the house, the leopard had gone back along the track, and as I followed his pug marks towards the kill, my hopes rose high, for up to that time I had not fully realized the degree of cunning that a man-eating leopard can acquire after 8 years of close association with human beings. I left the track and approached from the high ground, and from a little distance away saw that the kill had gone, and that the ground where the trap had been buried was, except for 2 pug marks, totally undisturbed. Sitting on the foot-high bank, as he had done the first night, the leopard had put both front paws between the cow's legs, but on this occasion he had spread them wide apart and rested them on the buried levers of the trap, which, released, would have closed the great jaws. Here, safe from the trap, he had eaten his meal, and when he had done so, he skirted round the flat ground, and getting hold of the cow by the head, had dragged it through the rose thorns and rolled it down the hill, where 50 yards lower down it had fetched up against an oak sapling. Content with his night's work, the leopard had then gone along the cattle track, and after following him for a mile, I lost his tracks on hard ground. There was no hope of the leopard returning to the kill. However, to salve my conscience for not having done so the previous night, I put a liberal dose of cyanide in the carcass of the cow. Truth be told, I hated the very thought of using poison then, and I hate it no less now. I visited the kill in the morning and found that a leopard had eaten all that portion of the cow that I had poisoned. So sure was I that the poison had been eaten by a leopard that had accidentally come across the hill, and not by the man-eater, that on my return to the village I told the headman that I would not stay to recover the leopard, though I would pay 100 rupees to anyone who found it and took its skin to the patwari. A month later, the reward was claimed, and the skin of a leopard, which had been dead many days, was buried by the patwari. It did not take my men long to pack up, and shortly after midday we started on our long journey back to Nainital. As we went down a narrow footpath to the Chatwa People Bridge, a big rat snake leisurely crossed the path, and as I stood and watched it slip away, Madhu Singh, who was behind me, said, "There goes the evil spirit that has been responsible for your failure." My action in leaving Garhwal to the tender mercies of the man-eater may appear heartless to you, and it did so to me too, and it was adversely criticized in the press, for the leopard at that time was daily mentioned in the Indian papers. In extenuation, I would urge that an effort entailing great strain cannot be indefinitely sustained. There were 24 hours in every day of the many weeks I spent in Garhwal, and time again, after sitting up all night, I walked endless miles next day, visiting distant villages from which reports had come of unsuccessful attacks by the man-eater. On many moonlit nights, when sitting in an uncomfortable position, physical endurance had reached its limit, and when sitting where it would have been easy for the leopard to have got at me, I had no longer been able to keep my eyes open. I had for hours walked the roads which were alone open to me and to the leopard, trying every trick I knew of to outwit my adversary, and the man-eater had, with luck beyond his deserts, or with devilish cunning, avoided the bullet that a press of my finger would have sent into him, for on retracing my steps in the morning after these night excursions, I had found from the pug marks on the road that I was right in assuming I had been closely followed. To know that one is being followed at night, no matter how bright the moon may be, by a man-eater intent on securing a victim, gives one an inferiority complex that is very unnerving, and that is not mitigated by repetition. Tired out in mind and in body, my longer stay at Rudraprayag would not have profited the people of Garhwal, and it might have cost me my own life. Knowing that the temporary abandonment of my self-imposed task would be severely criticized by the press, but that what I was doing now was right, I plodded on towards my distant home, having assured the people of Garhwal that I would return to help them as soon as it was possible for me to do so. End of chapter 14.